Chapter 17. August Gloops goes up the pipe.
When Mr. Wonka turned round and saw that what Augustus Gloop was doing, he cried out, "Oh no, please, Augustus, please. I beg of you not to do that. My chocolate must be untouched by human hands." "Augustus," called out Mrs. Gloop, "didn't you hear what the man said? Come away from that river at once." "This stuff is fabulous," said Augustus, taking not the slightest notice of his mother or Mr. Wonka. "Gosh, I need a bucket to drink it properly." "Augustus," cried Mr. Wonka, hopping up and down and waggling his stick in the air, "you must come away. You are dirtying my chocolate." "Augustus," cried Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus," cried Mr. Gloop. But Augustus was deaf to everything except the call of his enormous stomach. He was now lying full length on the ground with his head far out over the river, lapping up the chocolate like a dog. "Augustus," shouted Mrs. Gloop, "you will be giving that nasty cold of yours to about 1,000,000 people all over the country." "Be careful, Augustus," shouted Mr. Gloop. "You're leaning too far out." Mr. Gloop was absolutely right, for suddenly there was a shriek, and then a splash, and into the river went Augustus Gloop, and in 1 second he had disappeared under the brown surface. "Save him!" screamed Mrs. Gloop, going white in the face and waving her umbrella about. "He'll drown! He can't swim a yard! Save him! Save him!" "Good heavens, woman," said Mr. Gloop. "I'm not diving in there. I've got my best suit on." Augustus Gloop's face came up again onto the surface, painted brown with chocolate. "Help! Help! Help!" he yelled. "Fish me out!" "Don't just stand there," Mr. Gloop screamed at Mr. Gloop. "Do something." "I am doing something," said Mr. Gloop, who was now taking off his jacket and getting ready to dive into the chocolate. But while he was doing this, the wretched boy was being sucked closer and closer towards the mouth of one of the great pipes and was dangling down into the river. Then, all at once, the powerful suction took hold of him completely, and he was pulled onto the surface, then into the mouth of the pipe. The crowd on the riverbank waited breathlessly to see where he could come out. "There he goes," somebody shouted, pointing upwards. And sure enough, because the pipe was made of glass, Augustus Gloop could be clearly seen shooting up inside it, head first like a torpedo. "Help! Murder! Police!" screamed Mrs. Gloop. "Augustus, come back at once. Where are you going?" "It's a wonder to me," said Mr. Gloop, "how that pipe is big enough for him to get through." "It isn't big enough," said Charlie Bucket.
"Oh dear, look! He's slowing down."
"So he is," said Grandpa Joe.
"He's gonna stick."
said Charlie. "I think he is," said Grandpa Joe.
"By golly, he's stuck,"
said Charlie. "It's his stomach that's done it," said Mr. Gloop. "He's blocked the whole pipe," said Grandpa Joe. "Smash the pipe!" yelled Mrs. Gloop, still waving her umbrella. "Augustus, come out of there at once." The watchers below could see the chocolate swishing around the boy in the pipe, and they could see it building up behind him in a solid mass, pushing against the blockage. The pressure was terrific. Something had to give. Something did give, and that something was Augustus.
"Woof!"
Up he shot again like a bullet in the barrel of a gun. "He's disappeared," yelled Mrs. Gloop. "Where does that pipe go to? Quick, call the fire brigade." "Keep calm," cried Mr. Wonka. "Keep calm, my dear lady, keep calm. There is no danger whatsoever. Augustus has gone on a little journey, that's all. A most interesting little journey, but he'll come out of it just fine. You wait and see." "How can he possibly come out just fine?" snapped Mrs. Gloop. "He'll be made into marshmallows in 5 seconds. "Impossible!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Unthinkable, inconceivable, absurd. He could never be made into marshmallows. And why not, may I ask? Shouted Mrs. Gloop. Because that pipe doesn't go anywhere near it. That pipe, the one Augustus went up, happens to lead directly to the room where I make a most delicious kind of strawberry-flavoured chocolate-coated fudge. Then he'll be made into strawberry-flavoured chocolate-coated fudge, screamed Mrs. Gloop. My poor Augustus. They'll be selling him by the pound all over the country tomorrow morning.
Oh
Quite right, said Mr. Gloop. I know I'm right, said Mrs. Gloop. It's beyond a joke. Mr. Wonka doesn't seem to think so, cried Mrs. Gloop. Just look at him. He's laughing his head off. How dare you laugh like that when my boy just won up the pipe?
no!
You monster, she shrieked, pointing her umbrella at Mr. Wonka as though she were going to run him through. You think it's a joke, do you? You think that sucking my boy up into your fudge room like that is just one great big colossus joke? He'll be perfectly safe, said Mr. Wonka, giggling slightly. He'll be chocolate fudge, shrieked Mrs. Gloop. Never, cried Mr. Wonka. Of course you will, shrieked Mrs. Gloop. I wouldn't allow it, cried Mr. Wonka. And why not, shrieked Mrs. Gloop. Because the taste would be terrible, said Mr. Wonka. Just imagine it. Augustus-flavoured chocolate-coated Gloop. No one would buy it. They most certainly would, cried Mr. Gloop indignantly. I don't want to think about it, shrieked Mrs. Gloop. Nor do I, said Mr. Wonka. And I do promise you, madam, that your darling boy is perfectly safe. If he's perfectly safe, then where is he? Snapped Mrs. Gloop. Lead me to him this instant. Mr. Wonka turned around and clicked his fingers. Sharply. Click, 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 3 times. Immediately, an Oompa Loompa appeared, as if from nowhere, and stood beside him. The Oompa Loompa bowed and smiled, showing beautiful white teeth. His skin was rosy white, his long hair was golden brown, and the top of his head came just above the height of Mr. Wonka's knee. He wore the usual deerskin slung over his shoulder. Now listen to me, said Mr. Wonka, looking down at the tiny man. I want you to take Mr. and Mrs. Gloop up to the fudge room and help them to find their son, Augustus. He's just gone up the pipe.